What happens when Clint Eastwood and Barron Trump cross paths on a turbulent flight? A single act of kindness sparks an unbelievable chain of events that will leave you speechless. The Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, buzzed with energy as the private terminal filled with elite travelers, each waiting for their exclusive flights. Business executives tapped away at their laptops, celebrities hid behind dark sunglasses, and personal assistants made last-minute calls to finalize their itineraries. Among them sat Barron Trump, now 19 years old, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and tailored slacks, a picture of quiet composure. Despite the world knowing his last name, Barron had always preferred to keep a low profile, focusing on his own ambitions rather than living in the shadow of his famous father. As he absent-mindedly flipped through a book, a sudden murmur rippled through the lounge. A presence had entered the room, one that needed no introduction. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and filmmaker, walked through the terminal doors, his unmistakable frame silhouetted against the California sunlight. Even in his 90s, Clint still carried the same air of quiet authority that had defined his decades-long career. His movements were slower, his hair now a silver crown of wisdom, but his piercing gaze remained as sharp as ever. Accompanying him was Martin Harris, a seasoned former stuntman who had worked with Clint for years and now served as both his assistant and closest confidant. Martin, a rugged man in his 60s, carefully guided Clint toward the seating area, ensuring he had everything he needed before they boarded. Barron, noticing the subtle respect shown to Clint, glanced up from his book, momentarily forgetting the words on the page. He had grown up watching Clint's films, marveling at the way the actor commanded the screen with just a stare or a simple, deliberate line. He had never met the man in person, but there was something about him that exuded a lifetime of stories, victories, and battles, both on screen and off. Unlike the other travelers, who whispered and stole glances from behind their phones, Barron simply observed, intrigued but respectful. A staff member approached Clint and Martin with a professional but somewhat uneasy expression. Something wasn't right. The flight had been overbooked, and despite Clint's early reservation, there had been a mix-up with seating assignments. The airline had mistakenly given away his first-class suite, leaving him without a confirmed spot in the luxury cabin. The only available seat was near the rear of the plane, a standard narrow coach-class seat, a far cry from the comfort he was accustomed to. Martin, immediately frustrated, began discussing the issue with the attendant, but Clint simply waved him off, unwilling to make a fuss. Barron, still seated, overheard the conversation. His mind raced for a moment, considering what to do. Should he step in? Would it be too forward? Yet as he glanced back at Clint, who was adjusting his old leather jacket, he realized there was no question about it. Some people deserve respect, not because of their fame, but because of the life they had lived. With quiet resolve, Barron stood up, straightened his shirt, and took a step forward. He knew what had to be done. The private charter jet shimmered beneath the golden hues of the late afternoon sun, its sleek exterior reflecting the busy movement around the tarmac. Inside, the first-class cabin was nothing short of luxury. Hand-stitched leather seats, mahogany tray tables, and a selection of the finest gourmet meals awaited the passengers. Barron Trump settled into his window-side suite, adjusting his seat as a flight attendant handed him a refreshing towel and a pre-departure drink. He nodded politely, thanking her before unfolding the personalized menu, his fingers lightly grazing the gold embossed lettering. This was standard for high-profile travelers like himself, but despite the luxury, Barron never took it for granted. Just as he reached for his book, the low hum of whispered conversation caught his attention. The flight attendant, standing near the entrance, spoke in hushed but apologetic tones with Clint Eastwood's assistant, Martin Harris. Barron watched as Clint stood just behind him, his weathered hands gripping the strap of his carry-on, his expression unreadable. Something was wrong. Within moments, it became clear a critical mistake had been made. The airline had double-booked Clint's first-class suite, and with all other premium seats occupied, the only available spot left was a cramped economy seat near the back of the plane. Barron's gaze flickered toward Clint, who remained characteristically calm, his demeanor unwavering despite the situation. Martin, however, wasn't as composed. "You're telling me," Martin began, his voice strained, "that a man who has directed and starred in some of the greatest films in American history now has to sit in economy? That's what you're saying?" The flight attendant, clearly nervous, tried to explain that there was no way to rearrange seating without forcing another first-class passenger into the same predicament. Barron closed his menu, his decision made in an instant. He had been raised to believe that action spoke louder than words, and in this moment, there was only one right thing to do. Rising from his seat, he took a few steps forward, placing himself between the flight attendant and Clint Eastwood. "Excuse me," Barron said, his voice steady but polite. "Mr. Eastwood should take my seat. I'll take the economy spot." For the first time, Clint's gaze met Barron's directly, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if studying the young man before him. There was a long pause, filled only by the faint chatter of passengers settling into their seats. Finally, Clint let out a quiet chuckle, gravelly and deep, worn by years of experience and wisdom. "Son," he said, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, "are you sure about that?" Barron simply nodded. "Yes, sir." Another beat of silence passed before Clint slowly shook his head, a ghost of a smile appearing at the corner of his lips. "Not many people would do that," he murmured. The flight crew, momentarily stunned, quickly worked to transfer Clint's belongings to the first-class suite, while Barron's seat in economy was confirmed. As Barron stepped past Clint, moving toward the rear of the plane, Clint reached out and placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's a good thing you did, kid," he said, voice low but firm. "I won't forget it." As Barron made his way toward the economy cabin, the weight of his decision settled in. The luxury of first-class amenities, gourmet meals, and plush reclining seats had been traded for cramped rows, thin cushions, and limited space. He now found himself wedged between a chatty businessman who talked nonstop and a young mother struggling with a restless toddler. Despite the stark contrast in comfort, Barron felt at peace. He leaned back against the stiff seat, glancing toward the first-class section just before the curtain was drawn. Sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping aside for someone else. And though he had no way of knowing it yet, his simple act of generosity was about to set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The plane ascended smoothly into the evening sky, leaving behind the glittering lights of Los Angeles. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, some scrolling through their phones, others flipping through magazines or sipping on their drinks. In first class, Clint Eastwood reclined in the luxurious seat that Barron Trump had given up, adjusting his seatbelt as a flight attendant approached with a glass of bourbon. He nodded in appreciation, his weathered hands wrapping around the glass as he took a slow sip. A glance toward the economy cabin made him shake his head slightly. He had spent decades in the film industry, surrounded by power and wealth, yet this young man had just shown a level of humility and respect that was increasingly rare. In the back of the plane, Barron adjusted in his cramped seat, feeling the stiff cushion press against his lower back. The businessman beside him continued his endless chatter about stock markets and real estate, barely pausing to take a breath. Meanwhile, the exhausted mother in the aisle seat struggled to calm her fussy toddler, bouncing him gently on her lap. Barron offered her a polite smile before turning his gaze to the small airplane window. The sky was now a deep shade of blue, scattered with stars. For a moment, he let his mind drift, content with his decision, despite the lack of comfort. Then, without warning, the plane lurched violently, sending a jolt through the cabin. Gasps and startled cries filled the air as overhead compartments rattled, a few bags tumbling onto the aisle. The seatbelt sign flickered on, accompanied by the captain's calm yet firm voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected turbulence due to an approaching storm system. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Barron's hands instinctively gripped the armrests as the plane shuddered again, dipping slightly before stabilizing. The businessman beside him fell silent for the first time since takeoff, his knuckles turning white as he clutched his armrests. The young mother struggled to secure her toddler, who had begun to wail in distress. Across the aisle, an elderly woman whispered a prayer under her breath. The tension was thick, an invisible wave of unease spreading through the cabin. In first class, Clint Eastwood furrowed his brow, feeling the unnatural shake of the aircraft. He had faced dangerous situations before, war zones, near-fatal stunts, and life-threatening illnesses, but there was something about being 40,000 feet in the air with no control over the outcome that sent an unsettling chill down his spine. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest, a subconscious attempt to ground himself. Then the real danger struck. A deafening crack echoed through the fuselage, followed by the unmistakable sensation of a sudden drop. The plane plunged downward, sending drinks flying, passengers screaming, and overhead bins bursting open. Barron's stomach flipped as the G-force pinned him to his seat. The mother beside him clutched her child, her face twisted in fear. The businessman, moments ago confident and composed, now muttered panicked prayers under his breath. In the cockpit, the pilots fought for control, their hands gripping the throttles as alarms blared across the dashboard. The storm had come out of nowhere, a massive air pocket causing the rapid descent. The turbulence was relentless, shaking the plane as lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the panicked faces of passengers. Barron closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe steadily. When he reopened them, he noticed something remarkable. Clint Eastwood was making his way toward him. Despite the chaos, the older man had unbuckled himself, carefully gripping each seat for balance as he navigated toward the economy cabin. His expression was calm, though his eyes were sharp with determination. When he reached Barron's row, he steadied himself against the seat in front of him. "You doing okay, kid?" Clint asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the surrounding panic. Barron, surprised by the gesture, gave a small nod. "Yeah," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I've been through worse." Clint smirked slightly. "That's a good attitude," he said, gripping the headrest for support as the plane continued its turbulent battle against the storm. "Just remember, fear's just another test." For the next 30 minutes, as the pilots worked to stabilize the aircraft, Clint and Barron sat side by side, bridging the gap between two generations. The young man, raised in privilege but guided by humility, and the older man, shaped by resilience and decades of wisdom, found themselves bound by an unspoken understanding. One forged not by fame or fortune, but by a simple act of kindness and the shared experience of facing the unknown. By the time the storm began to ease and the plane regained steady altitude, an unbreakable connection had been formed, one that neither of them would ever forget. As the plane steadied and the flashing seatbelt sign dimmed, the collective tension inside the cabin began to ease, though a lingering unease remained in the air. Passengers slowly loosened their grip on armrests, some exhaling deep sighs of relief while others whispered reassurances to their seatmates. A flight attendant made her way through the aisles, checking on passengers, her hands slightly trembling from the ordeal. The mother beside Barron Trump wiped tears from her cheeks as she cradled her now sleeping toddler, offering a silent nod of gratitude toward him for helping keep her calm. The businessman, who had spent the entire flight boasting about his high-risk investments, sat in stunned silence, his earlier bravado completely gone. Clint Eastwood, still seated beside Barron in economy, adjusted his jacket and let out a small chuckle, breaking the heavy quiet that had settled between them. "Well," he muttered, shaking his head, "I've done some crazy things in my life, but I don't think I've ever had a flight quite like this." He turned slightly, studying Barron, who was still staring out the window at the faint glimmer of lightning in the distance. "How are you holding up, kid?" Barron took a deep breath, his hand still gripping the seat's armrest, though not as tightly as before. "I'm all right," he admitted, finally turning to face Clint. "That was intense." His voice was even, though his mind still replayed the terrifying moments when the plane dipped violently through the storm. He hesitated before adding, "I guess I wasn't expecting this when I gave up my seat." Clint smirked, nodding in approval. "Life's funny like that," he said. "You do one good thing, and suddenly you find yourself on an entirely different path than you planned." He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. "But let me tell you something. There aren't many people who would have done what you did." Barron tilted his head slightly, curiosity flashing across his face. "What do you mean?" Clint studied him for a moment, then exhaled deeply. "Most people wouldn't have given up a first-class seat without a second thought," he said, "especially someone in your position. People assume money and status mean everything. But you?" He nodded toward Barron, his eyes serious. "Nah, you proved that respect and character still count for something." Barron felt a flicker of warmth at Clint's words, but he shook his head. "I didn't really think about it like that," he admitted. "I just saw someone who deserved the seat more than I did." Clint let out a quiet chuckle. "That right there," he said, tapping the armrest, "is exactly why it matters." He shifted slightly, his expression turning reflective. "You know, I've spent my whole life telling stories, directing, acting, shaping how people see the world. But stories don't just exist in movies. They exist in real life, in moments like this." Barron frowned slightly, intrigued. "So what's the story here?" Clint smiled, his gaze sharp yet kind. "The story," he said, "is that a young man gave up something valuable without expecting anything in return, and in doing so, he showed the world what real respect and humility look like." He paused before adding, "And maybe, just maybe, that's a story worth telling." For the next hour, the two men talked about life, ambition, responsibility, and the importance of integrity. Barron listened intently as Clint shared stories of his early struggles in Hollywood, how he was rejected over and over before landing his breakthrough role, and how he had built his career not just on talent, but on perseverance and staying true to himself. Barron, in turn, spoke about his aspirations, about wanting to carve his own path rather than just be known as a president's son. By the time the plane prepared for landing, something had shifted. Barron wasn't just a polite young man who had given up his seat, and Clint wasn't just a Hollywood icon. They were two individuals, two generations, bonded by an unspoken understanding that respect, character, and the willingness to put others first were far more valuable than any first-class seat. As the plane descended toward the runway, the city lights of Dallas stretched out beneath them, a glowing tapestry of streets and skyscrapers. The intercom crackled to life as the pilot's voice came through, steady but slightly wearied. Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our emergency landing destination. Thank you for your patience during this unexpected detour. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival. A murmur of relief rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged tired but grateful glances, still shaken but thankful to be safe. Barron Trump sat back in his economy seat, exhaling as he gazed out the window, watching the ground draw closer. Beside him, Clint Eastwood adjusted his jacket, his sharp eyes scanning the faces around them. There was something different in the air now, a quiet understanding among the passengers, a realization that, for a brief moment, they had all shared something profound. The storm had tested them, and now that they were through it, they carried a newfound appreciation for the fragility of life. As the wheels touched down with a firm but steady jolt, a round of applause broke out across the cabin, a spontaneous release of tension and gratitude. Even Clint, a man rarely impressed, nodded in approval. "That was a hell of a ride," he muttered, stretching his legs as the plane taxied toward the gate. Barron chuckled, shaking his head. "Not exactly what I expected when I got on this flight," he admitted. The moment they stepped off the plane into the Dallas terminal, reality rushed back. Reporters, having already caught wind of the emergency landing, gathered near the gates, their cameras flashing, eager to catch a glimpse of the passengers. Barron sighed, instinctively pulling his collar up, while Clint smirked. "You ready for this, kid?" he asked. Barron let out a small laugh. "Not really." But before they could be swarmed, a flight attendant approached them. Her eyes were bright with admiration as she spoke softly. "Mr. Trump, Mr. Eastwood, just wanted to say what happened back there. It meant something. People saw it. That kind of kindness isn't something you see every day." She hesitated before adding, "I think people need to hear about it." Clint exchanged a look with Barron before nodding. "She's got a point," he said. "Maybe it's time for a good story." A few days later, Barron's phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. "Barron, it's Clint," came the unmistakable gravelly voice. "Got a minute?" "Of course," Barron replied, sitting up straight. "I've been thinking about that flight," Clint said, "about what you did, about how people don't hear enough stories like that anymore." He paused. "I've got an idea for a film. Something about kindness, about how one small decision can change everything, and I want you involved." Barron blinked, taken aback. "Me?" Clint chuckled. "You already inspired it, kid. I just need your perspective." There was a long silence as Barron absorbed what was happening. A legendary filmmaker, one of the greatest storytellers of all time, was asking for his input. But more than that, Clint saw something in him, something beyond just his name. Finally, Barron exhaled, a slow smile forming. "I'd be honored," he said, and just like that, a simple act of kindness had transformed into something far greater, a story that would soon inspire the world. The soft glow of the setting sun cast long shadows across Clint Eastwood's private ranch in Carmel, California, where the rolling hills stretched toward the horizon, kissed by the golden light of dusk. A gentle breeze rustled through the towering oak trees, carrying with it the distant hum of waves crashing against the cliffs. Seated on the wooden porch, Clint and Barron Trump leaned back in their chairs, their gaze fixed on the tranquil landscape before them. Between them sat two glasses of iced tea, condensation forming on the glass as the warmth of the day began to fade. It had been months since the now famous flight, and much had changed. The story of Barron's quiet act of kindness had spread far and wide, turning into something far greater than either of them had expected. The film Clint had envisioned, a project about the power of small, meaningful actions, had taken shape, bringing together actors, writers, and visionaries who believed in the message. More than just a film, it had become a movement, inspiring thousands to embrace the idea that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to create ripples that extend beyond what we can see. Clint took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down, his weathered hands resting on the armrest of his chair. You know, he said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence, I've spent my life telling stories. Some were about heroes, some about outlaws, but the best ones were always about the choices people make when no one's watching. He turned his gaze toward Barron, his eyes filled with something between admiration and wisdom. That day on the plane, you made one of those choices. Barron, now more at ease in the presence of the Hollywood legend, smiled slightly. I wasn't thinking about the impact, he admitted. I just did what felt right. Clint chuckled, shaking his head. That's the thing, kid. That's how real change happens. Not through grand speeches or big gestures, but through small decisions that show who we really are. The younger man nodded, reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that moment. He had spent much of his life trying to step out of his father's shadow, wanting to create his own identity, something beyond politics and legacy. Yet in the simplest of moments, giving up a seat on a plane, he had found a path he never expected. One built not on status, but on values. A comfortable silence settled between them before Clint stretched his legs and smirked. You know, he said, we should probably tell people to keep this kindness thing going. Barron laughed. You mean like subscribe and comment? Clint winked. Exactly. Turning toward an imaginary camera, Barron's expression grew sincere. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, what's the last act of kindness you've done for someone? Let's keep the ripple effect going. With that, the sun dipped below the horizon, and two men from different generations, different worlds, but bound by a single moment of kindness, sat back, watching as the first stars blinked into the night sky, knowing that their story was only just beginning. In a world that often feels fast-paced and self-centered, this story reminds us that small acts of kindness can create life-changing ripple effects. Barron Trump didn't give up his seat for recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do. That's the lesson. Character is built in the moments when no one is watching, whether it's holding the door for someone, offering help without being asked, or simply showing respect. These choices define who we are. Clint Eastwood's wisdom reinforces the idea that real impact isn't always loud. It's found in the quiet, meaningful moments that shape people's lives. Today we live in a digital world where negativity spreads fast, but so can goodness. Be the reason someone believes in decency again. A small action, a kind word, or a selfless gesture might not change the world overnight, but it can change someone's world today.